Hey Patreon viewers, welcome to all the new people. Quite a number of new people have joined Patreon in the last month, which is obviously great for me. Thank you for joining, welcome. Yeah, it's great that you want to see extra content here, so here is some. So you will have hopefully seen by now that I put up a video talking about pipe back blades, some of which are littered around me. It all started off because I realised that this tulwar, which isn't mine actually, as I mentioned, that's actually Scott Brown's, but he bought it at a fight camp from a friend of mine, actually from Gavin. I think it was from Gavin. Or maybe it was from Colin, I can't remember now, but anyway, he bought it off one of my friends, and it's being shipped off to Florida, back to Scott. But this has a pipe back on it, and this prompted me to go and talk a bit more about pipe back blades. Now, in the past I've spoken about pipe back blades particularly on British military swords, but I've mentioned the fact that they turn up on Prussian and sometimes Austrian and Swiss and Italian as well. I didn't mention Italian swords. Now, as it happens, I actually have an important pattern of Italian sword, which I would have sold a long time ago actually, because I don't particularly want it in my collection. It doesn't fit in my collection, but I've kept it specifically to make a video about it, but I just haven't got around to doing that yet, so it's just sitting with my stock essentially before selling it. But that's the 1871 pattern, and that has a pipe back blade as well. Now, I've always found it, as I mentioned in the previous video, I've always found it particularly odd that pipe back blades suddenly got popular in continental Europe in the middle of the 19th century, let's say the 1850s, 60s. And by the 1870s and 80s, there were several regulation patterns, particularly in Italy and Prussia and Switzerland, which had pipe back blades. And this has always struck me as strange, because why? Why did they go for pipe back blades rather than fuller blades? But the brief answer is I don't actually know. I don't really understand it. It's one of those great mysteries. So I don't have any great revelations, unfortunately, to offer on that topic. I'd like to know if you've got any ideas why these blades suddenly got so popular, or indeed if you know Italian or German or maybe even Spanish or other sources, Swiss sources, that talk about these types of blades and what their potential advantages may have been perceived to be, then feel free to share that, because obviously I read as many sources as I can, but I can't read Spanish, my Italian's not great, I can't read German, and my French is comme ci, comme ça. There might be foreign language sources that explain this stuff that I don't know about. But I do think it's interesting as well. We often talk about sword evolution or development, and Britain isn't, or England is, whichever you want to speak, however specific you want to be, is never usually regarded as a pioneer in sword development. Usually we talk about Spain or Italy or sometimes Germany, depending on what period we're talking about. But in actual fact, in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, England was actually quite pioneering in sword development. And in fact, it had been at various other points in history as well. If we go to the 16th century, Henry VIII's reign, so the first half of the 16th century, as I've mentioned before, Britain really pioneered the development of basket hilts. And basket hilts are still thought of as a kind of more of a Scottish thing, actually, I think, in the modern mind. But that's only because they survived in Scotland, arguably later, slightly. But in the 18th century, you know, basket hilts were still the ubiquitous British, not just English or Scottish, but British, even in Ireland and Wales, British kind of sword. Now, basket hilts were also popular in Germany in the 16th century, and in Italy with the Schiavona or Schiavona, depending how you pronounce it. I'm never really sure about that one. In the 16th and into the 17th century as well. But pipe back blades, this is the point I'm trying to make, that pipe back blades were really, I kind of see them, apart from the fact that they have earlier ancestors, as far as Western Europe's concerned, were really promoted and pushed in Britain. But then abandoned, more or less, in around 1845, 1850. So why were they, you know, popular in Britain from about 1810 to 1815, right the way through to 1845, and then abandoned, and then after that they became popular in the rest of, or in certain other parts of Western Europe? Strange, bizarre, I don't know the answer to that. But if you have any ideas or any extra information that I don't know, feel free to share it. I'd really appreciate that, actually. It's useful to me. I always want to learn more. But one specific thing I want to talk about before I finish up here is I talked about how the pipeback blade probably descends from not the tulwar specifically, but the kilic or pala as it's sometimes known. So the Turkish Ottoman sword, which also influenced some Indian tulwars and Persian swords and swords from other areas as well. But there is another weapon which has this pipe back, or in this case T-back blade. Now I mentioned yataghans. A related weapon is the Afghan chara or chura or Khyber knife. Known by various names depending where exactly you are. So the chura and chara are different, I believe, different regional names for it in India. And in an episode of Forged in Fire where they supposedly reproduced one of these, actually the things didn't look much like these at all. They called them the chare. I don't know where they got chare from, but anyway, all of the period sources that I know of and I've documented and studied and read say either chara or chura. Okay, right, so but the Khyber knife anyway has, as you'll see, a T-section blade at the back, broad T-section blade there, and then a thin, essentially quite flat blade. In fact, yeah, I mean it is a wedge section. If I look down from the point, it is in fact a wedge section, but it's a very flat wedge section, so it's almost a flat blade with a T section at the back, so a T like girder essentially. And what this does lead to is a very flat blade with minimal resistance, at least for that depth, and quite good edge geometry for cutting, but obviously only cutting to a certain point. And then you're going to meet this rib at the back, and that's really what I wanted to say was, it's kind of surprising. The Khyber knife was quite feared as a chopping weapon, and I've mentioned these before. There are sources that refer to the fact that despite the fact they're pointy and would make very good thrusting weapons, the Afghans or Pathans and Afridi and the other people that made up the Afghans at the time, or as they were known, usually known as Pathans, I think from the language, from Pashto, they were known for chopping and cutting, and in fact there's, as I've said, I think at least a couple of videos in the past, there's a British Army doctor of the 19th century who talks about these weapons and the fearsome wounds that he had to stitch up from chops, but he says, you know, it's a good thing that they don't stab with them because they'd actually be more likely to kill people if they stabbed with them, and actually they just chop, and we don't, and he kind of says, you know, I don't know why they don't thrust with them, but they don't. There are many reasons why this might be. It could just be they're poorly trained and it's human instinct to do this. It could be that in many cases when they practice fighting, they maybe they banned the thrust in villages. We know there's certain types of dueling or almost ritualized combat systems where they do take out the most lethal things so that people can have a fight and settle a matter without having to kill each other. There are all sorts of possible explanations for why they didn't thrust with these things. Could be a specific reason, could just be no reason, in other words, just because it's more natural to do that. We don't know. But what I want to say is it's kind of ironic that this is known as a fearsome chopping or cutting weapon, and yet it's got this T-section at the back. And that, of course, relates to how we view pipe-back blades as well. And again, I don't really have an explanation for that, I'm afraid. Now, one final thing I wanted to mention on these is, yes, they're fearsome choppers. Yes, they do cut well. Yes, they are related to pipe backs and probably to Turkish weapons by the fact that they've got this rib at the back, which definitely adds to stiffness, but coupled with lightness. So you end up with a broad, light blade, still stiff. But these are often quite poor quality, in fact very poor quality steel blades. And now, how do I know that? Well, I know that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I've had a lot of these things through my hands over the years that have been in my collection or that I've bought to sell, and they're very often bent, okay? And I have straightened them, and they are very often very easy to straighten. So many of these, you have to bear in mind, Afghanistan, whilst it has had some very wealthy and powerful lords, overall, mostly through history, Afghanistan has been quite poor. It's quite poor in resources. It's relatively low population for the geographic size. Has never had huge industries, this kind of stuff. So India was rich, Persia was rich, Afghanistan was poor, and was used as the battlefield for lots of other powers around it, whether it be between the Persians and the Indians or between the Russians and the British. And in modern years, obviously, between other powers. Okay, in Afghanistan, they had to make use of what they had, okay? And so the steel quality is often quite poor, and they often seem not to be heat treated. I don't know why. Maybe it's because they didn't have a high enough carbon content to quench them. Maybe it's because they didn't trust the integrity of the steel, and if quenched, you know, you'd rather have a weapon that bent rather than snapped. I don't know, okay, but very often these are soft. Now, I suspect that in many cases they are edge quenched, and I know for a fact that just like Japanese swords, which are edge quenched, I know that some Indian swords were edge quenched. So given the geographic proximity and similar technologies and similar weapons in some cases, I suspect that many of these were edge quenched, but that maybe the quench didn't always take because there wasn't a high enough carbon in the edge, this kind of stuff. But these are often very poor quality, and whilst they are quite nice to look at and they're quite well made in terms of craftsmanship, often the material of the blade is very poor. Now, unfortunately, I wouldn't talk about this on the public channel, but a friend of mine used one of these for test cutting quite a few times. Now, I have used antiques for test cutting. I've spoken about the pluses and minuses of using antiques for that purpose and the risks you have to accept. I think there are some swords it's worth risking it with. There are some swords it's definitely not worth risking it with. And there are some swords which are in a hazy kind of grey ground in the middle. In terms of these, one of the problems is the hilt construction very easily comes apart. Whilst there are rivets holding elements of this hilt together, it's also partly glued together, and the glue over 100 years, or even more in some cases, gets old, gets dried out, old, and doesn't really adhere things together like it did when it was new. So the hilt can often come apart. Most commonly, the horn, or sometimes ivory or bone, the horn grips here. The back strap, which goes all the way around, in fact it's the front and back strap in this case, and these two elements either side, the ferrule, let's call it, which makes up the kind of guard, as much as a guard as it's got. Okay, so all of those elements can and will fall off if you give this violent shock. If you bang it against things or twist it or give it torsion, this kind of stuff, even if just vibrations might make these fall off. I have fixed up a couple of these which came to me kind of already broken. They're not that difficult to fix, and indeed you can use modern epoxy, and in fact it will glue it better than the original glue did. But the blades as well are often quite poor quality steel, and as I mentioned, very often not heat treated. Now, I know of this person that I referred to. This had used this kyber knife for cutting quite a few times, and it cut well. That's how I know that even with the T-section rib at the back, they do still cut water bottles and presumably meat well. They are good choppers. They've got a nice feel to them. They're not heavy, but the point of balance is quite far up the blade, so they've got a decent heft to them without being heavy, so you can accelerate them quickly and they transfer a lot of energy to the target. They've also got good edge geometry, they pass through things well, but not if they break, and that's what happened to this blade, unfortunately. And it didn't break at an obvious weak point, like the thinnest point of the tang or the hilt or the thinner part of the blade. It broke slap bang in the middle at the point of impact. So it was hitting a water bottle, nothing more offensive than that. It was hitting a water bottle with about the middle of the blade. It was a sharp blade, and it just snapped. Terrible, that's an antique destroyed. So that highlights the risk of using antiques for that sort of purpose. But it also, from a scientific, let's take away something positive from this. From a scientific point of view, it also illustrates what crap quality the steel of that blade was. And in combat, absolutely, if that kyber knife had been used in combat and hit someone in the head, or a hard part of even padded clothing, but in something like a musket or a rifle or hard piece of equipment like a backpack or something, that blade may also have broken in use. So there we go, just really to highlight that we know that historically swords and knives of all and weapons of all qualities did sometimes break, but obviously the poorer quality weapon there is, the more likely it will break. And just because an antique has survived for 100 or 150 years or more doesn't mean that it's necessarily good quality. It might just mean that it was never used in earnest and never used in combat. And if it had been just once, that blade would have broken 100 years ago, the pieces would have been recycled to make kitchen knives or something else, and that Khyber knife wouldn't have survived to us. So there we go. A few sort of stream of consciousness thoughts about pipe backs, Khyber knives, sword quality, and all sorts of other things. I hope that's been interesting, and thanks again for your Patreon patronage, for watching the extra videos, and I hope that they add more to your viewing pleasure and information than just the public channel does. I greatly appreciate Patreon, and actually YouTube Adpocalypse has basically wiped out any amount of decent profit that people are earning through YouTube these days. So the Patreon videos that I do and you patrons supporting the channel are really what keeps, and this is true of any YouTube channel, not just mine, it's really what's keeping those channels afloat, not YouTube. I'm afraid YouTube dollars have dried up significantly now. So go Patreon, thank you very much for your support, and I hope that that I give you some extra value for your donations, and that you're getting something out of the Patreon channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers folks.